And yet, financial planning is the most important thing I've done in my career. The people it's helped, the lives it's impacted, the difference it's made in the lives of hundreds of families, dozens of communities, just from my experience alone. I have been the first person someone has called to let know that they are pregnant and expecting their first child. I've also had some couples decide whether they were going to have kids or have more kids based on the advice that we've given them. I've had to hold someone who lost their spouse unexpectedly and delivered the life insurance check to them personally. I've gotten to help open new businesses. I've had to console someone as they shut their business down. And I've been asked more times than I can count at this point to be somebody's executor or trustee for their estate. It's a level of trust and perspective and privilege that I think is seldom replicated in most other lines of work. Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Welcome, folks. This is going to be a bit of a unique episode because it's going to be both longer than the usual episode, and it's just going to be me today. Before I get started, I'm going to do something a little bit unusual in addition to everything I just said, and I'm going to give a trigger warning on this conversation. I'm going to talk about the highs and lows of launching a financial planning practice. That involves discussion of mental struggle, mental illness. So if you're in a place where you don't need to hear about that right now, please just take the time to take care of yourself. Spend the time you would have spent listening to this episode talking to someone who doesn't just listen to you, but hears you. Additionally, I've tried to avoid naming people in this as much as I can. That isn't because people in the story aren't incredibly important to it, but because a lot of the people in the story have a guarantee of confidentiality as clients or as people who helped in secret or in confidence over time. So please know that even if I don't say your name or bring you up and you're in this story somewhere, you have my deep appreciation. And just because I didn't say, thank you, Bob, it doesn't mean that you've been forgotten. You really have all played just such an incredibly important role in this story. So with that, let's get into it. I had the strange pleasure last week at the XYPN Live conference of essentially getting to tell my story, or certain important parts of it anyway. I've observed, and it's been observed over many years, and frankly by many keen observers of the human condition, that one of the things we crave most is to be seen and heard, not merely listened to. This week is a particularly auspicious week, and today is a particularly important day in my life and journey, so I'm indulging in that craving to be seen and heard to tell you my story as a financial planner in as much excruciating detail as you will permit me to do. Today is October 25th. It is not the day I started my financial planning practice, but it is the day that my firm became what it has become. It has been 5 years to the day since I sent a letter that would take my wealth planners from a financial planning practice to a financial planning firm, but I'm getting ahead of myself in that story. Before I became a financial planner, I had a few other occupations. I spent 6 years in the United States Army as a PSYOP specialist. PSYOP stands for Psychological Operations, or more colloquially, Psychological Warfare. During the last 2 years of my time in the Army and in the transition to civilian life, I had a few occupations. During the last month of my apartment lease, but no longer working full-time in Army things, I worked security for Securitas at the Service Employees Industry Union International Convention in Denver, where I was paid to stand around in a blue polo watching people get drunk and do bad skits about the Monopoly Man as a caricature of a business owner. I then transitioned to working for IBM in their IT services division for the next 3 years. Where I did everything from take calls in a call center to transition the IT services of one of the largest banks in the world under IBM Service Division as a trainer and project manager. About a year into that 3-year stint at IBM, I started a remote MBA program. I'd studied history, political science, and military science while I was in undergrad and while I was still kind of active in the Army. And while that means you get to read a lot of interesting stories and debate how the world really works quite often, it also means your transferable skills are pretty nominal. You can read and write quickly, you can put together narratives and stories, and have a pretty decent idea about the differences between a democratic Congress and a parliament. These are unfortunately seldom skills you're going to be hired and paid for, mind you. You might get paid to teach them, or you might be the rare practitioner in those fields. But frankly, it's a lot of reading and not a lot of value. So I started the MBA program with the goal of getting some business skills that might see me be qualified to climb the ladder at IBM more than a degree in history and poli-sci was going to do. Just over a semester into the program, I got called for jury duty. And this event is unremarkable in of itself, but for the lunch break, actually. They had 2 cases they were trying to get a jury for that day, and as a result, the voir dire was taking essentially the entire day. They let us out for lunch and gave us almost 2 hours before we had to come back. If you're not aware, the courthouse in Boulder is about a 2-block walk away from the Pearl Street Mall, so I wandered over to find lunch, and as I was doing so, remembered that a captain from my Army Reserve unit said he worked at a company on the Pearl Street Mall. So I wandered in without an appointment and asked if Mr. Kittle was in, and he came out and surprisingly invited me to come back. He was working as a controller for the company at the time, and as he perused spreadsheets and worked, sort of indulged me in asking me about my life and what I was doing outside of the Army Reserve at that point. I mentioned the MBA program, and he asked, are you doing a concentration? Are you focusing on something? And I said I was starting the marketing specialization because that seemed the most tangentially related to what we did in PsyOp. And I'll never forget how badly that disrupted his workflow, because he stopped what he was doing and he leaned over the desk and he looked at me and said very clearly, "That's fucking dumb. Marketing is easy. What's the thing you're worst at in the program?" Now, you can debate the marketing is easy thing and whether it's dumb or not. But at the time, I thought about that. And I had been in a managerial accounting class and a leadership class in the first semester. And while leadership is squishy enough to be pretty easy by default, I had really only scraped by in accounting. So I said accounting. And he said, why? And I said, because it's math. And that's just an area I've never really been good at. And his response was to say, then do the math concentration. Accounting, finance, whatever they have in your program, do the hardest thing in the program as your concentration, because everything else will be easier and you will never have to feel like you can't do one of those easier things because you've already mastered the hard thing. So I took that advice from him in his office at Kidrobot, and I went back to jury duty, and I got dismissed an hour later and went home to update my MBA's concentration to one in finance. I finished my MBA over the next year, and as I was getting into the last semester, I started the job hunt. And initially, I wanted to find something inside of IBM, but as I quickly learned, there was really no dedicated talent management program or division or path in IBM to really get promoted from one part of IBM to another. The IT services division I was in was fine, but most people a step above me in the organization had been there for 15 or 20 years, which just gives you an idea of how slow that climb might be or how little progression there might be inside that organization. So I took 2 days in February and I went to a career fair at my graduate school, and I made a list of every single technology company and financial company at the career fair. I put on my best suit and tie. I printed resumes. I ordered job-seeking business cards, which I'm just going to tell you right now, don't order business cards that just say you're looking for a job. And I went to the career fair. And I was pleasantly surprised that while I found a good bit of resistance from the technology companies, because even though I worked at IBM, they were really there to hire computer science people to be developers, I had enormous luck on the financial side of things. I got an interview essentially at every single bank and credit union and insurance company and financial services company that was there. And as it turned out, I did pretty well at those. I got an offer from essentially each and every place I interviewed. But as I was interviewing, I did notice trends between the various financial channels. Every bank or credit union seemed like it was operating on a fixed calendar. Your career was going to be a junior loan officer, and then you were going to be a regular loan officer, and then a senior loan officer, and then you might specialize in something like commercial or credit products, and then you'd become a branch vice president, and then a branch president or a manager, and then a regional manager, and so on and so on. Like every 2 to 3 years, there was going to be a stepping stone that came with a small change in responsibility and a small change in title. If you're not aware, in the world of banking, it seems like everybody is a vice president, for example, so titles don't really mean a lot in that space. And that's all fine, but what stood out to me in that process was that it didn't seem to matter if you were good at what you did. Being the best was not going to accelerate that path, and even mediocrity didn't seem to have much of an effect on the timeline. And frankly, that just didn't appeal to me. When I was interviewing with insurance companies, what wasn't readily apparent at first, but what became extremely obvious only a few interviews in, was that these were all going to be captive agent sales jobs. Now, to be clear, I didn't know what a captive agent was at the time, but the pitch for the opportunities was essentially, we'll pay you a stipend for a year or two to build an agency from the ground up, is selling XYZ mutual home and auto insurance or XYZ mutual life and disability insurance. And when I ask, hey, do you sell any other type of insurance or insurance from any other companies? They'd always look really like taken aback. Like, well, yeah, you can, but why would you? XYZ mutual insurance is the best insurance, as shown by these stellar ratings from Moody's and AM Best and all the other ratings companies you've never heard of. And I'm not too bright. But even I can spot an irreconcilable position between every single insurance company telling you that not only do they have the best product of one type or another, but that they all have the best products, and that all the same third parties say they have the best products. So then as I got into what I'll call finance interviews, they really fell into two camps. There were institutional finance companies and personal finance companies. And the institutional finance companies were hiring for things like their support teams or service teams, or in some cases, junior analysts in their fund management divisions. The personal finance companies were hiring in a similar way to the insurance companies, but I'll talk about them a little bit more in a moment. For the institutional insurance companies, they weren't offering bad pay or opportunities, but I decided to turn them down for a couple of reasons. First, all of them wanted you to relocate to work in one of their offices, so you'd have to move to Kansas City to work at American Funds or Colorado Springs to work at T. Rowe Price, and so on and so forth. And I mean, that makes sense. They want you to work in their facility, and if their facility isn't where your college is, you're going to have to relocate. Not a big deal, but just what didn't appeal to me. The other thing is that what I'd just come from was essentially a cubicle farm in working at IBM. Right? I had a little desk that had little gray walls and dividers, and you could look over it and see the next person and 20 rows of other people. And, even though it would be a financial cubicle farm instead of a technology cubicle farm, I didn't really want to spend my career in a gray cloth box, just staring at computer screens and never really seeing anybody other than the people to my left and to my right. So I focused in on the personal finance side instead. And to give you some context, before I studied finance in my MBA program, my experience with financial services could be summed up pretty succinctly. My parents opened a checking account and a savings account for me with a local credit union when I was 12 and would transfer my allowance and that sort of thing into it so I could buy stuff with a debit card. And later when I got my first high school job at Target, I'd get my actual job paychecks put into those same accounts. I had to sign about $8,100 EE savings bonds during one of my semesters of college because my parents saved for my college using EE savings bonds, a statement that I'm very grateful to say, but also cringe at the thought of, knowing what I do now about 529s and other more efficient ways to save for college. And I opened my first credit card with the same credit union in my first semester of my MBA program so I could afford the $300 managerial accounting textbook. It had about $1,000 credit limit, and that's all I ever really used it for up to that point. At some point, I'd gotten about $3,000 in a CD at the credit union. And when it matured in 2012, I vaguely knew that I should want to get a better return than the CD rate, which was something like 1% at the time, because this is post 2008 crash. So there are no yields, and the Fed's paying rock bottom rates and so on. So I went to the credit union and I asked a teller in the branch if they had any other investment options, and she pointed me to the office of their financial advisor, a man named Robert, who was in fact a CFP professional. And over the next 30 minutes, he sold me some incredibly bad C-share actively managed mutual funds. And over the next few years, those funds grew in a Roth IRA. And we'll talk more about that later. Suffice that bit of history to say, I didn't really know much about personal finance when I started looking at getting a job in personal finance. As part of my finance concentration, I'd taken a financial planning class that covered topics like Social Security and retirement planning, and a few other courses like corporate valuation and bond pricing, and in the main curriculum, a portfolio management class. So while I had a general education in topics like investments and planning, I was nowhere near being a specialist at the time. But still, like the banks and the insurance companies and everything, I went and had interviews with all the companies you'd imagine. Northwestern Mutual, Guardian Insurance, Edward Jones, Merrill, Fidelity. And as with all of these other institutions, they gave me a job offer, or at least wanted me to move past the point of no return in their recruitment pipeline. And that last phrase is important, that point of no return in the recruitment pipeline. What I didn't know at the time was that none of these opportunities were jobs in the conventional sense. I wasn't going to show up on Monday and two Fridays later get a paycheck for 1/26th my annual salary, or 80 times my hourly rate minus deductions for health insurance and the 401k plan. While some of these opportunities offered a starting stipend that would go away quickly, plenty of them didn't offer anything at all, and these were, at their heart, sales jobs. And I'll be honest, I didn't find that appealing at all. But remember that I was interviewing in all the assorted channels at the time. I didn't interview banks first, and then insurance, and then financial services. This is all happening concurrently. And so while 100% on commission, unlimited earning potential opportunity was sort of terrifying to me and not really what I was looking for, as I started to eliminate certain channels and opportunities, I was finding that I wasn't saying no to these potential positions. I'd turned down the banking jobs because I was frustrated at the idea of advancing on a timeline rather than on merit. And I actually remember talking to the president and CEO of First Bank, that First Bank here in Colorado. Apparently, those two gentlemen interview all their potential bankers that they hire, which is kind of cool. Seems like a lot of work. But, I remember asking, hey, I'm a veteran and I have an MBA. Is there any increase in compensation or any sort of bump or bonus you get for being more qualified than a plain, bachelor's of finance graduate with no experience? And they said, no, it doesn't make any difference to us. So the lack of merit just really was a little bit frustrating for me. I'd turned down the insurance jobs because it didn't make sense to me that any one company could somehow have the best product for every problem. That just didn't seem realistic. And I turned down the institutional finance jobs because I didn't want to live in a cubicle. So I had to make a better decision about where I wanted to start my career in the personal finance side of things. And the irony was, and is, I wasn't aware of it at the time. I was actually just applying in one corner of that industry. Every firm at the career fair was the type of firm that brought people in as contractors in volume, right? Hires, hundreds or thousands of people a year, have them sell their products or do business on their platform, and does business with the expectation that most of the people they bring in to do that are going to fail, and only a few are actually going to be with them long term. So in my search process, I ended up with kind of three primary criteria for the firm I wanted to work for. They had to do financial planning. I'd taken that financial planning elective, and I understood implicitly that any investment or insurance or other financial product could only really make sense difference in somebody's life in the context of a holistic plan. If you don't have a holistic plan, then you don't know if it's actually going to accomplish what you're hoping it's going to accomplish. And then the problem with the insurance companies and the problem with many of these personal finance companies is that they wanted you to drink the company Kool-Aid and sell their products only. So my second criteria and my compromise on this, as I came to learn that all of these companies have their own products or insurance, for investment, whatever it was that they could have their own products, but I didn't want to be locked into these products. I didn't want to have to sell a certain amount or use a certain amount or only be allowed to use a certain amount. It had to be sort of agnostic where, yes, it's an option, but you can do something else if you want. And I wanted to own the client relationships that I developed. And this was important to me because by the time it came down to the wire, I had to acknowledge that I was sort of making a best guess. I had a gut feeling that this would be the right option for me, but I didn't know and I couldn't be sure. So, much like the desire to avoid proprietary products where I might not be able to take a client with me, I wanted to be sure that, in general, it was a contractual guarantee that client relationships were something I owned, or at least something that I wasn't going to get sued for taking with me if I came to learn that wherever I chose to work, I was not going to be there forever. And so in that whole process, I probably spent the most time with 3 companies and got furthest along with those 3 companies, Guardian Life, Northwestern Mutual, and Waddell & Reed. Guardian Life had an office in Fort Collins and ran a fairly thorough training and vetting process for onboarding. They even had a full-time recruiter, an Air Force veteran named Marcus, and that I spent a pretty good chunk of my time with. They offered me a $3,000 per month stipend, and that I'd be paid something like 50% of my revenue until that stipend was replaced. And I'll admit the exact number eludes me now. It might have been 60%, but something in the neighborhood of 50%. And then, I ended up declining Guardian's offer really for 2 reasons. Number one, they emphatically required that while you could do financial planning, you had to put a life insurance policy in place for somebody before you could do anything else, even if they didn't need a life insurance policy. And they didn't put it that way. They essentially just sort of argued it as everybody's underinsured, and even somebody who doesn't need life insurance probably needs more life insurance because life insurance is great or something like that. Secondly, they didn't seem to have a real financial planning tool. They had some sort of software that you had to pay $100 a month for. It's called like the Life Plan, Life Path Guide or something like that. In hindsight, it was essentially a fancy life insurance calculator, but it definitely wasn't a robust financial planning tool. So then Northwestern Mutual is the one I probably got the least far into the process with of the 3 that I still got spent the most time with. I interviewed at an office in Broomfield that was affiliated to a larger regional office in Denver. The recruiter was nice and talked about how she'd met her husband working there and all the support and camaraderie and so on. That one fell through for 2 different reasons than Guardian, even though by the power of hindsight, they were pretty similar organizations. First, they expected me to be based out of an office in Denver. And if you're from Colorado and you've driven through Denver on I-25, you've seen it. It's just off Colorado Avenue and I-25 by the University of Denver, big brown building with the Northwestern sign on top. I was living in Longmont, and while I wouldn't have minded living in Denver or moving to Denver, I had almost a year left of my apartment lease, and a 46-mile one-way commute daily did not appeal to me in the slightest. And even more so, though, the second factor that really bothered me was a lack of integrity on the part of the recruiter and management. Now, to be clear, they didn't ask me to do something like super unethical, like steal somebody's information or something like that. It was more internally unethical. It came up during my interview process that I actually lived in the regional territory of an office in Fort Collins. I guess Northwestern kind of has carved up the map of the United States, and they have little regional territories and whatnot. And their policy was that agents belong to the regional office based on where they live. And so because I lived in Longmont, they suggested that I use my cousin's address in Broomfield to hide the fact that I wasn't actually living in their territory. I'll be honest, I don't think that would have mattered much in practice, but it bothered me that they could so casually suggest going around their own company's rules just to justify winning a particular hire or recruitment. And so if they were going to suggest breaking their own rules in this context, what other gray areas and line crossing were they going to encourage dabbling in later? So it just didn't feel comfortable with me. I ultimately turned them down. And so from that, by process of elimination, you can assume that I settled on Waddell & Reed. And if you assumed that, you'd be correct. This was ironic because on some level, I think the interview and recruiting process with Waddell & Reed is probably the worst of any of the firms I'd interviewed with, at least in the financial services context, and at least it was the least compelling recruitment process. They weren't trying to get me to join by talking up unlimited earning potential or sharing stories of meeting their spouse at the company or showing off nice cars or glossy brochures. They had a plain gray office in Fort Collins, among others in the area, and seemed to have a rather quiet and frankly kind of conservative culture. What ultimately appealed to me was that they did provide all of the criteria I'd decided mattered to me. They took financial planning seriously. They'd been an early sponsor of the organizations that later became the CFP board and the College for Financial Planning. They had proprietary products, Ivy and Waddell and Reed advisor funds, but they were preferred by the company, but they were not mandatory. And helpfully, they'd also just won the Barron's rankings for the best 10-year performance of a fund family. So that somewhat smoothed over any reservations about using those investments early on. And that was also a bit short-sighted on my part, but I was green enough to take it in stride at the time. And because the position was a 1099 contractor role, they firmly and contractually established that your client relationships were yours and you could take them with you if you decided to leave. They really saw themselves as a platform to do business on, not as the owner of your firm or your practice. So I turned down a handful of salaried offers from banks that would have paid me 20 to 30% more a year than I was making at IBM at the time. I stopped answering calls from the insurance agencies because even once I said, no, I'm going to go a different direction, they kept calling to say, hey, have you changed your mind? I let Guardian and Northwestern Mutual and the other financial services firms know that I'd taken a different offer, and I started studying. This is all happening in February and March of 2015. I stopped making extra payments on my grad school student loans and started saving about $500 a month. And I spent every bit of my free time at and outside of work and in between work and just finishing my last courses in my MBA and studying for my Series 7 exam, which is the registered representative stockbroker license. I graduated with my MBA on May 15th, and I sat for my Series 7 on May 18th. I passed, and then I went on to take my Series 66 12 days later, and then I wrapped up my insurance examinations a few weeks later in June. And then I gave my 2 weeks notice at IBM on July 2nd, and I started my practice as a financial planner on July 16th. I had just over $5,000 in my checking and savings. I promptly spent $1,000 on a laptop that I didn't need, but I thought I was going to need a new fancy computer to do stuff on. I spent $200 on a set of golf clubs, a sport that I have never played, or at least had never played at the time. And I started my career as a financial advisor at Waddell and Reed Financial Advisors. A really common practice in the financial services industry for personal finance is to make candidates for financial planning positions build a list of people they know and to have pre-activation, pre-launch conversations with them about financial planning or their experiences with financial services. This is perhaps one of the more poorly explained processes at the time. Of the many firms I spoke with before making a commitment, almost all of them discussed one or both of these activities. And in each case, it's highlighted that you should be excited about what you're planning on doing and that you will want to prepare to tell everyone you know about it when you get started. And the conversations are ostensibly supposed to be so you can get advice on your new career path. But in reality, what you're really supposed to be doing is sparking people's interest in you and getting them to advocate for you and support you. And so while you're not licensed, you can't ask for business or commitments. So you're told or you're taught not to ask for business. But the part in which this is poorly explained is that the real goal of this activity is to give you an initial pipeline of friends and family and coworkers with a warm start to get business development going when you launch. When I start my practice on July 16th, 2015, I can now say with the power of hindsight that I did not understand, nor did I take that pre-launch activity as seriously as I should have. Over the next month and a half, I had a dozen or so conversations with ex-coworkers catching up on what I was doing since I'd left IBM. Talked to a few family members who awkwardly and clearly didn't understand why I was out of the blue asking them about finances and what they do around their finances. And I otherwise spent almost all of my free time in between those conversations getting more and more anxious. I'd been making about $3,200 gross a month at IBM, which is about $2,400 take home, which was enough to pay my $980 monthly rent, and my health insurance, which had originally been like $40 a month, was suddenly going to be $350 a month. I'd already spent a quarter of my savings, or almost a quarter of my savings, on day one for the laptop and the golf clubs. And I had burned through another couple $100 the day I started my practice flying out to San Antonio to be best man in a friend's wedding. And by the end of August, I had $0 in my checking and savings account and an available credit card balance of $1,000 left to me. But still, by the end of August, I'd finally gotten one friend from grad school to sign up for a $500 financial plan, and a family member had agreed to invest their retirement savings of $160,000 in an investment management product available through Waddell and Reed at a 1.3% annual fee level. At the time, the payout percentage for new advisors at Waddell and Reed, or what in the industry is called the grid, was about 60% for these types of business. So Waddell and Reed also encouraged investment management over commission product sales by lending you up to 3 years of revenue upfront on any new recurring investment advisory business. So that meant that for the $500 planning fee, I got paid $300. And for the quarterly fee on the $160,000 account billed in arrears, that was going to be $520. But because I got credit for bringing in $6,240 of revenue because of the lending program, that meant I got paid $3,744 for the investments I brought in, plus $300 for the plan. And so my first paycheck as a financial advisor was $4,044 gross. And I'm going to say right now, picking up my first paycheck from the office in Fort Collins, having just missed 3 paychecks in a row from IBM since I didn't work there anymore, I sat in my car and I'm punching the air and I'm just screaming, yes! Because I was just so optimistic at that point, right? Before I started, who knows if I'm going to get anybody to say yes and sign on this. But now I've made money doing this. I've replaced my monthly income already. So I'm not going to fail. I'm not going to have to go home and beg mom and dad for help or quit and go back to another career. And I was making money, more money even than I'd made at IBM at the time. And then 2 months later, in October, I opened my first Chase credit card, a Chase Freedom card with a $7,000 spending limit. I remember the first thing I ever bought with it was buffalo wings at the Dark Horse in Boulder, going out with my cousin and some of his friends at CU Boulder. And I opened the credit card and I paid for the wings with it because since that $4,044 paycheck in August, I'd only made another $540 selling 3 separate financial plans for $300 a piece to 3 old coworkers from IBM. I was already broke again, and just having paid rent and health insurance, basic groceries, and an enormous amount of gas and coffee and food and traveling to have a conversation with anyone who would talk with me or to me. So I took out a $7,000 credit card, and in October I paid my rent with it, and I stayed fed, and I kept the car fueled with it. And things picked up a bit past that point. I brought on the biggest self-sourced client of my first year in November, which gave me enough to pay off the credit card balances, both the $7,000 Chase card and also the old Credit Union $1,000 card, which I tapped out before taking the Chase card out. And my manager at Waddell & Reed gave me, or referred to me, a client relationship he'd cultivated from a referral from his sister. And this happened mostly because these clients are or were at the time in Arvada. And while they were great clients, as a manager, he was only allowed to have 10 clients. So he gave them to me, I think, mostly because I was literally geographically the person closest to them living in Longmont, whereas most of the office he was responsible for lived up in Fort Collins or Loveland or out in Greeley. So I managed to claw my way through the first year, and I received some awards and recognition for it. I ended the year with $91,000 of gross revenue. Again, not my take-home pay, but how much business I actually developed and grew and revenue I created, and not even in reality, because a ton of that was that 3x multiplier provided by the whole lending 3-year credit bonusing program thing that they had at Waddell & Reed. And, it's funny because this was a particularly auspicious figure to make it to 91,000 because there was a first year bonus for new advisors tied to doing over 90,000 in your first year. And I qualified for it by going to my parents and asking if they would pay $2,000 for an advanced estate plan that they didn't need, because the bonus on top of the 60% payout for the $2,000 commission would be big enough that I should or could be able to pay them back almost immediately, and I'd still have something to show for it with the bonus. So it was sort of they got a free service, essentially. They'd get paid back, I'd get a bonus. And they said, hey, you don't have to pay us back immediately, which was good because it took me 6 years to pay them back with interest, though they never even asked for interest. I never even actually brought up the money they'd spent in the first place. At the end of 2015, my net income for the year was $23,296, which essentially amounted to the money I'd made year to date at IBM before giving my notice and quit to become a financial advisor. So essentially, I had made my IBM money, and then I just broken even and survived for that 6-month period when I got started. This also included a $155 grid payout for reinvesting my Roth IRA from the credit union financial advisor in Class A mutual funds, solely so I could get a bit more money on a paycheck. And honestly, imagine paying $258 in commissions out of your own savings just so you can take home $155. You might suggest, of course, that it would have been logically a better idea to just tap into my retirement account early, but something about that idea felt like a bigger failure than churning my own portfolio for a commission. At the end of the first year, I ran into what was colloquially known as the sophomore slump. This phenomenon occurs because largely, a lot of financial advisors, myself included, really focus on their natural market when they get started. So we talk to our friends, our family, our coworkers, people we know, etc. The people that we already know, unfortunately, is a finite group of people. And so essentially, anyone who is going to become a client has already become a client by the end of your first year. And at that point, you have to face the reality that you can't just live off of the relationships with your friends and family. You're going to have to go find clients among the rest of the world, the people you don't know. In my first year, I'd done a couple of like fishbowl lunches. Yeah, and you've seen these before. These are like glass bowls or vases or something in coffee shops or restaurants offering like a free lunch or a gift card and a random drawing if you leave your business card. The not so secret of those, of course, is that half the cards in the bowl were already there when the bowl was placed. So it looks like the bowl is a popular idea. And in reality, every single person who puts a business card in the bowl is going to get a free lunch along with a conversation about financial planning or investing or whatever else seems most relevant to them. I was entirely unsuccessful at this, but there was a nice team of firefighters and a team of junior employees from a local advertising agency who got some nice lunches at my expense. And frankly, they had to suffer through me awkwardly trying to talk to them about financial planning. So seems fair, all things considered. The only other thing I'd really done in my first year was getting involved in several chambers of commerce. I joined the Boulder, Fort Collins, Longmont chambers, and steadily, particularly in the Longmont chamber, I'd gotten pulled onto essentially every committee, including public policy, young professionals, education, ambassadors. And this is a great investment of time and has been really meaningful to my business over the past decade, but it was not sufficient at the time. I hadn't been involved long enough to really build the deep relationships that would later yield clients, and I wasn't the only financial advisor in the ecosystem. So at the end of my first 12 months and practice in mid-July of 2016, going into my second year, right, because of the sophomore slump, until November, so July 16th until November, I made nothing. Or less than nothing. After 6 months at Waddell & Reed, you got paid on your percentage grid, but you also had to pay a fixed monthly cost of about $500 to pay for all the technology and resources you were using, like investment research software, planning software, email, cybersecurity, all that stuff. And so from July through August, I lived in the end of first year bonus, or rather, I lived on the end of first year bonus that I had gotten. And then from September to October and into October, I lived on the credit union credit card and the Chase Freedom card. And then I took out another Chase card, the Chase Unlimited Freedom card, which also came with a $7,000 spending limit. And I remember sitting in my office on election day in November, because it's 2016, waiting for somebody who ended up ghosting me for that appointment because it was election day in 2016, and wondering if I was going to make it. I made it a year, but I had seen no movement, no new opportunities, no new business, anything for now 4 months, longer than it had been even when I got started. And I was halfway through maxing out the new credit card when I finally got a referral. One of my friends and coworkers from IBM who'd done a $300 plan just over a year ago at the very beginning said, hey, my girlfriend's dad needs an investments guy. That guy, because the relationship with his current financial advisor had soured, he had some very specific investment ideas and just really put me to work. A portfolio, something that was really bespoke to his needs. By the end of November, he had finally agreed to an investment strategy, and because it was 2016 and the financial service industry seems to run 2 decades behind modern technology, I found myself paying $56 to overnight 200 pages of new account paperwork to him, and then another $56 in postage for him to send it back overnight. And fortunately, once he made the decision, he was not the type to drag his feet, because by the time the paperwork was submitted and his money had moved in early December. I was $15,000 in credit card debt. I had literally no money in my checking account, literally no money in my savings account. And, that means if you're keeping count, right, I'm maxed out on credit cards and broke, truly broke. I placed about $10,000-ish in commissionable trades on his accounts, meaning that I got paid about $6,000, which allowed me to pay off enough of one of the credit card balances to make it into the new year. And the commission nature here is just that he really wanted, hey, I want you to pick good long-term buy and hold investments. I don't want you to manage and shuffle things long-term. So that was the arrangement why we did commissions instead of advisory. That might have cost a different amount. At the end of 2016, looking back at even the bonus earned at the end of the first 12 months in July and whatnot, I ended up filing a 2016 tax return that showed that I only made a net income of $15,969, despite doing a total of $111,000 of business that year. It's not an exaggeration to say that had my friend not decided to give me the name of his girlfriend's dad and talk to him about it beforehand, I would not be a financial planner today. I would have had to resign, go to mom and dad for help with the rent, or move back in, and I would be doing something else today. I would have been part of the failure statistics. And if I'm being honest, frankly, given the level of stress and anxiety that I felt, I was pretty well on my path to deciding that if I wasn't going to make it, I was probably just going to kill myself for the failure. Because that's what I felt like at the time. I had joined the Army with the intent to be in the Army for my entire career, and then had lung health issues that saw me having to exit at the end of my enlistment. I'd gone to IBM and started to build a career there, only to find out that there was no career to be built. And here I was on my third act, as it were, launching a business that felt like it was failing and felt like I was drowning in. I'm not proud of the fact that I felt weak in that moment. And in hindsight, I'm not sure that being $15,000 in credit card debt or asking my family for help was such an inescapable pit of failure and despair that would warrant something so dramatic as killing myself. But when you are depressed, when you are feeling that low, it's not about the relative logic or irrationality. It's about how you feel, or rather, it's about how you don't want to feel anymore. So I'll say very directly here, Anthony, I need you to know that referral probably saved my life. "2017 represented the beginning of a climb out of darkness. I wasn't yet at the point where any of the loans I'd been given as part of the 3-year advance were paid off, or that recurring revenue was picking up in any meaningful sense. But finally, my time volunteering in the community as part of the Chamber of Commerce, among other social activities and nonprofits and whatnot, was starting to pick up, as were referrals from the clients I'd brought on in my first year. Despite the upward trajectory, the highs and lows were still irregular enough that I had to take out a third credit card. This was also compounded by the ending of the 3-year loan program at Waddell & Reed, which shrank to a 1-year advance loan program, so that new investment business was only 1/3 as valuable to me. But from a take-home paycheck standpoint. However, at this time, I'd also gained enough confidence to start charging a bit more appropriately for financial plans. For example, $2,000 instead of $300. And I'd gotten a bit more comfortable with some advanced life insurance strategies, like using life insurance, long-term care hybrids to maximize somebody's pension income while still protecting their spouse, and adding some sporadic insurance commissions to my income. And still, by the end of the year, I'd done about $150,000 of business, which meant I got paid gross about $90,000. But because of the credit balance I'd built up in the prior year, and because of how significant the peaks and valleys of the current year were, on top of how much I was investing in trying to just get the business really growing, I tried to spend money to make money, I showed $5,496 of income in that year. So even less than the first year, less than the second year, functionally. If you're doing the math on that, I essentially lived on the credit cards all year and spent everything I brought in on the business. And so in 2018, we finally reached a really important milestone in the practice, not only because income finally began to start a lasting climb that has persisted to this day, but also for 3 particular reasons. First, it's the year I became a certified financial planner, or CFP professional. That's really important because while you only need certain investment or insurance licenses to give financial advice or to sell financial products and services, the CFP certification has been a gold standard designation for financial advice professional competency for many decades now. It doesn't make you the master of anything or ensure that you're 100% competent and infallible at everything, but it does demonstrate that you are serious about your profession. A CPA might do for an accountant, or passing the bar might for an attorney. It was evidence not just for clients or the public that I was serious about doing this, but that I was going to last doing this. The second reason it's important is because it's the point at which I decided that financial planning itself was actually the most important thing I did. The economic reality of just trying to survive as a financial planner or financial advisor made it so that up to that point, the most important part of whatever I did for a client or potential client was whatever they needed most, and therefore whatever would get me paid by working for them, or whatever product they needed to buy that would satisfy their financial need. There's a joke among insurance agents and stockbrokers that CFP stands for can't fucking produce, because young advisors will waste, and I say that loosely, but waste their time learning to do financial planning instead of getting out there and selling products or services. They're not wrong, particularly in the early days. In an eat what you kill 100% commission environment, studying for the CFP is a bit of a waste of time insofar as it's not time being spent staying alive in the business. Yet obtaining the CFP certification was the point where I decided I needed to make most of my living, or at least as much of my living, from being paid to do financial planning, not solely from just being paid to manage clients' money or selling them an insurance policy on an as-needed basis. And that leads to the final point, survival. I said earlier that Wood Allen Reed was conservative in how they recruited people to be financial planners. Part of that was in giving you a lot of education and tools like spreadsheets on how much you needed to sell or do in business development to survive in the business. By the end of your first year, only 60% will be left. By the end of your second year, only 35% of you will be left. By the end of your third year, we'll be lucky if more than 15% of you are left. While before you're in the field, these seem like notional figures that suggest like you might fail, like you just have a basic understanding of probability. It's a different thing to see it in action. During my licensing studies, I'd had a compatriot named Rebecca who joined the candidate process at the same time as I did, who failed the Series 7 and had to drop out before I got licensed, or just before I got licensed. Another person in that group named Ryan got licensed, but then he was gone before the first year was up. He just didn't make it. And even as I kept pushing to stay in the business over my first few years, I'd see people ahead of me in the process fold up shop and go work for somebody else, or quit and go back to their old career. And as I progressed and saw other people start after me, I got worse and worse about learning their names or learning about them as individuals, because so many of them came and went before it really had time to stick. Even among competitors in the community, I met dozens, maybe even hundreds of other financial advisors or financial professionals from other firms like Wood Allen Reed at networking events or meetups. And months or years later, I'd Google them, or I'd wonder, hey, whatever happened to that person, and find out that they had quit or dropped out at some point since I'd last seen them. Later, I'd even see one of them working at Home Depot blending paint, even as months before she had told me, really nonchalantly, this is the easiest thing in the world. Turns out it's not. That pivot in 2018 made me start thinking about being a financial planner more seriously, or thinking about being a financial planner in a much more serious way. So I joined the Financial Planning Association, or FPA, and even though I was a bit too far removed from the Colorado chapter, which sort of lives in South Denver, generally speaking, I got more involved online through private Facebook groups for financial planners, and through that process, I found myself taking a tour to FPA of FPA conferences in 2019. And that turned out to be one of the most important decisions I made. I'd been to several financial planning conferences internally at Wood Allen Reed over the first few years of my career, where topics like how to market on social media or advanced life insurance strategies would make up the sessions, interspersed by celebrity keynotes by famous people like Marcus Luttrell, or private concerts by Pat Benatar. Really, really cool stuff, but maybe not the most value-adding. And despite the much lower budget point of the FPA conferences, I learned about something that was missing in the Wood Allen Reed environment. which was real financial planning. And that's not to say that financial planning wasn't done or high quality at Waddell and Reed, but it was, despite its kind of deep history and roots, a transactional product service discovery process. A potential client paid you a fixed fee for a financial plan. You built them a financial plan for that fee, but kind of the real aim of the business model was to help them implement it, which then meant opening accounts, managing money, or selling them the necessary insurance policies that the planning process helped you identify. So the planning was valuable, but you sort of intended to make more money off of the implementation than off of the planning. And from a business perspective, then in some respects, the client was paying you to identify what you should then sell them or implement for them. And this isn't actually all that unusual. If you think about a dynamic like, let's say, doctors who are paid by you or your insurance company, and then whom you may pay again to perform a procedure or treatment, or who otherwise might prescribe medication that you'll also pay for. But that analogy does sort of break down, right? The difference really exists when you consider the aim of the doctor in the first appointment is seldom to hope that you're sick enough to need a follow-on procedure or prescriptions, and probably doesn't get paid more than, for those than they do for the initial checkup, insofar as whether it makes sense or matters to them from a business end, whether you do or do not have an ailment that needs more treatment. I don't know, that's a little convoluted, but yeah, I hope you follow the idea. In fact, there's a good chance that those professionals are not even directly involved in the procedure or the prescription at all, right? They're just professionals being paid to diagnose you, and then what you need is what you need. Anyway, real financial planning was and still is financial planning for its own sake, right? Being agnostic to how your clients accomplish their financial goals, but also making it your singular purpose to help them build the plan and implement it in the best way possible for them, whether that means letting them do it on their own or delegating it to you. And most importantly, I think came a piece of wisdom, and the phrase was this: they are not us, we are not them. And that was from one of the lately departed leaders of financial planning, Richard Wagner, or Dick Wagner, as he was known. The idea that financial planners should utilize the tools that are made available by industry, such as ETFs or insurance policies, but that we shouldn't have a hand in manufacturing them, or we shouldn't be beholden to companies that do manufacture them. I came back from the FPA retreat in San Diego in the spring of 2019 with my curiosity sparked, and I returned from the FPA Next Gen gathering in New Orleans the month following with my mind made up. I'm going to be a real financial planner. I didn't want to leave Waddell & Reed for a variety of reasons. It had taken me almost 4 years to reach a point where my income was becoming stable and regular, and I was, finally by 2019 contributing to my retirement plan since the first time since I'd left IBM. Right, I'm a financial planner. I'm not saving for my own retirement because I can't afford it. And I was getting to the point where the credit cards were finally paid off, and perhaps most importantly, I was aware that while my contract said you can take your clients with you, that in practice it's only so easily said rather than done. So I wasn't shy about my ambition. I didn't want to leave, but I wanted to do things differently. And I met with planning executives at Waddell & Reed to talk about a vision for doing financial planning in a different way and having a different business model to support it. They weren't unsupportive, but they seemed confused by the idea of being so insistent on building a practice in the manner I was considering. I met with the president of Waddell & Reed's Financial Advisors Division and discussed it with him. He was more supportive and understanding and suggested that maybe we should have a conversation in a few months while he explored the idea internally. Hey, could we implement this? And suggested, hey, we'll do that. You do your own research. And we scheduled a call for October 24th, 2019. Over the few months between June and October, I did do my own research. I explored technology. I interviewed other financial planners who'd gone independent. I talked to Waddell & Reed alumni specifically who had made the leap from Waddell & Reed to independence or just to go somewhere else. And I poked around every nook and cranny I could think of and find just to be certain that if I was going to go independent, I'd be well prepared to do so. And again, I didn't want to leave Waddell & Reed. Compliance is a scary thing, and the idea that clients might not follow you leaves you with a bit of dread about jumping out of a plane without a parachute, and there's a great deal of comfort in the familiar. But I recognize that my request might be fundamentally incompatible with the business as it existed. And frankly, no company in its right mind is going to carve out a one-person niche channel specialized thing for me to just go do my own thing. So that was just a different relationship. I was able to go do some foundational work. Earlier that year, Waddell and Reed started allowing advisors to start operating businesses as a doing business as, or a DBA, meaning you didn't have to have Waddell and Reed financial advisors on your business card, but you could have Yerger Financial or something like that. Initially, I applied to use the DBA My Financial Planners, but I was shot down because apparently regulators didn't approve of the use of financial planners as a title or name by firms that were more focused on implementation than planning. So I pivoted to My Wealth Planners, which is the name of the firm today. That summer at the annual client appreciation party that I threw every year, I announced that I would be moving my practice in this direction. Not that I'd be going independent, mind you, but that I would just be foregoing future sales of investment or insurance products in favor of a more heavy emphasis on planning. And a few clients asked questions about what that might mean in more practical or applied terms. And at the time, I could only really generally suggest that it might mean bigger challenges later on. So October 24th finally rolled around. I had a 30-minute appointment scheduled with the president of Waddell & Reed, and that conversation lasted for an hour and a half. I think he did a phenomenal job of making me feel heard, of being entirely open to the idea and the conversation. There was no defensiveness or threatening or enticing or coercion or fear-mongering. It was a genuinely pleasant and professional conversation. But at the end of that conversation, it boiled down to this. While he was open to the idea of creating something like what I was suggesting at Waddell & Reed, it would take a lot of time to accomplish, and it would require patience on my part. He invited me to be part of the process of shaping it if I'd like to. And that really just came down to an ask that I wait and see how things shook out. And I came off that call, and the decision was essentially made for me at that point. I was going to have to leave Waddell & Reed and go independent. So I sent an email to the compliance consultants I'd been talking to and let them know, hey, I'm going to be putting my notice in. Please prepare to file and register me with the state of Colorado. Of course, as I sent that email, I realized that for all my preparation, I'd actually failed to prepare properly in some really specific ways. And of course, it's the moment you hit send that you realize you've made a mistake. The tentative plan of departure involved furnishing my notice, as I was just said, I was going to put my notice in the mail that day, and utilizing the broker protocol, which is an industry standard that guards financial advisors and their firms from lawsuits, so long as certain practices are adhered to. However, despite knowing what the protocol was, I hadn't actually looked up how to fulfill it. The protocol required that the firm you were leaving and the firm that you're going to both be signatories to the protocol, and that when leaving, you could only take a specific list of 5 data points with you, and you have to provide that same list to the firm you're leaving as evidence of exactly what you are taking. You can take clients' names, address, phone number, email, and the title of the accounts, but not the account numbers or any of the other data related to them. And I had not made that list. So my trip to the post office to send my resignation was delayed. And then as I was creating that list to send in with my resignation, it also occurred to me that clients were going to be left in a lurch by this decision to give notice. So then I spent another couple of hours putting together change of agent packets for all the insurance policies I'd put into force over my careers, including letters to those clients who would need those policies changed over to a different agent, explaining exactly what would need to be done. And I also decided I would ask the home office to reassign all of my accounts to a team of 2 advisors I knew pretty well up in Fort Collins, so that the clients would at least have someone to call that wasn't just in a home office call center or something like that. And then I wrote up a letter to those folks as well and explained that my notice had been sent and that I'd asked for the reassignment of accounts and policies to them. And all of this is happening in one afternoon as I suddenly realized the importance of doing all of this now that I've already made the decision. So finally, much later into the day than I'd planned, I went to the post office with my assorted envelopes for clients and the broker protocol list, and I stood in front of the mailbox. This was it. This was going to be the point of no return, because once you resign, they're not going to take you back. And it was after hours, and if I put my notice through the slot, there was nothing that was going to stop it from showing up in Kansas City at the Waddell & Reed home office the next day and trigger the end of my career in practice at Waddell & Reed. So I pulled out my phone and called my biggest client, and I just said, hey, I wanted to let you know I'm about to send in my notice to Waddell & Reed, and I'm going to file with the state of Colorado to open my firm. I can't really talk to you about that because of how regulations work, but I just need to know if I leave, if I do this, when the time comes that I can ask you seriously, would you be willing to talk about coming with me? And they said yes, and I put the overnight envelopes in the mail. The next day, October 25th, my compliance consultants filed for registration, and I spent a good chunk of that morning with my notice still in the mail on its way to the home office, sending out emails to every client explaining that today was going to be my last day with Waddell & Reed, providing them with instructions on how to handle things after I was gone, ensuring that they had any and all documentation that they might need in the immediate future. And so today is the anniversary of that day. It has been 5 years since my notice was sent and received by Waddell & Reed, and my notice to start My Wealth Planners was filed with the state of Colorado. I had to wait 4 weeks to hear back from Colorado, and then we had a meeting a week later and then made some updates, and after a week after that, on December 6th, the firm was officially registered and active in the state of Colorado as a registered investment advisor. So over the next few weeks, I called and met with every client, and much to my present surprise, all but 2 clients made the decision to come with me. That'd be 73 out of 75 for context. And of the 2 that didn't, one simply just never picked up, but she had always been really hard to get in touch with. And the other said she simply didn't want to go through the hassle of moving. And you know what? Fair enough. I joked at the time that the worst possible thing that could happen in this whole transition would be if the market crashed suddenly after I went independent. And it turns out life has a sick sense of humor, because only 2 months later, the market would begin the bear market crash due to the COVID pandemic. So despite the crash, no one panicked. And perhaps because of COVID, no one seemed quick to blame me for the sudden downturn. And maybe everyone just had more important things on their mind. But I'll share, for those wondering how much longer the story goes on. The next 5 years are going to be much, much faster than this first hour or so. So because of the sudden loss of income in October with Waddell & Reed and the delay in getting registered, I stopped making money when I filed my notice, and I had one last bad income year. I earned only a net value of $21,874 in 2019. When I left Waddell & Reed, I had about $12 million in assets under management, and my revenue at the time was on track to hit about $200,000 annual. So instead, the year ended short at $158,522. And in transitioning to this real financial planning idea, the move to independence included cutting several client fees and expenses that had previously been in place to fund the difference in Waddell & Reed's take and what was paid out via the actual credit grid. So clients with annual fees such as 1.3% baselines were cut down to 1%, and other fees and expenses such as 0.15% platform fees or product expense ratios averaging 0.7% were suddenly being cut to 0 and 0.04% respectively. Yeah, as a result, while I was on track in 2019 to bring on $200,000 gross, 2020 ended up being a year where we made about $189,192.60, to be specific. Even worse, or perhaps better, I had a very bright intern that summer, Samantha, who I offered a job when she graduated in the spring. Mind you, I needed about $250,000 in annual revenue to actually support that job. So I spent the fall of 2020 and the spring of 2021 working my butt off to be able to afford her when she graduated. Fortunately, I managed it, and she joined me as my first full-time employee and associate financial planner in June of 2021 and stayed with me through July of 2023. In the time since, the firm has made and grown as such. We transitioned with 73 clients, $12 million in assets under management, and about $200,000 in annual recurring revenue in 2019. By the end of 2020, we had 84 clients, $22 million under management, and $189,000 in revenue. By the end of 2021, we had 111 clients, $31.5 million in assets under management, and about $332,000 in revenue. By the end of 2022, we had 143 clients and $399,000 in revenue. And that sounds like a bit of a slowdown, but you have to remember that the market also essentially tumbled the whole year of 2022, excuse me. And so 2023 became the year that marked the next and present phase of the practice. As I mentioned before, Samantha was with me from June of 2021 through July of 2023. She left to move to Austin with her longtime boyfriend. And that did leave me in a bit of a pickle because I was going to get married in September. And the TD Ameritrade Schwab merger was also going to happen in September. So I sprinted to hire an assistant to start in August and hired the former owner of a coffee shop here in Longmont, Emily, who had transitioned jobs from surgical technology to entrepreneurship during the pandemic, and now getting out of entrepreneurship was looking for a second career. And I don't think I've ever hemmed and hawed over a decision of who to hire more in my life, to be honest, because there was another phenomenal candidate who had applied as well. But still, Emily got the job and managed to hold down the fort as I married Caitlin, and we traveled to the other side of the world for our honeymoon. We ended out 2023 with 155 clients, $515,680 in annual revenue. And I also realized by the end of the year that despite a 5-year business plan, we were already after 4 years where I thought we'd be in 7 or 8 years. So we put out a hiring notice for a planning analyst to join us in 2024. We received an application from a precocious and bright man from New Jersey, Daniel Stefanski. And having had 4 years of experience already as a financial advisor, Daniel had decided he was going to go from working in an investment sales shop and not a real financial planning shop to take a pay cut, turn down another offer offering to pay 85% what we were offering. And he moved halfway across the country to join our team. He came to us this June, and to be honest, I don't think I've ever been more humbled in my life by the commitment somebody was willing to make for something that I've built or helped build. We were also joined by one of the partners from that team in Fort Collins, Greg, who sold half his practice to his partner and asked to take a handful of clients with him and came to us to learn real financial planning. And he joined us back in March of this year. But I do have to stop talking at some point. There have been a lot of lows. And on some level, I think I've shared my story here in such detail because I do want to scare someone thinking of doing it themselves. I am lucky. I am incredibly lucky. I am outright blessed by good fortune to still be doing this. Going into debt when I had never been in debt before was not a pleasant experience. Going into debt to the tune of $1,000, $8,000, $15,000, $24,000 on and off over the years until finally hitting a point where I never had to do that again was terrifying. And I'll say, staring at an empty calendar in the fall of 2016 when there were no client meetings, no prospects, and no opportunities on the horizon is one of the toughest things I've ever had to face. And I didn't arise to the challenge at the time or to the occasion. I sat on my couch and I played Metal Gear Solid 5 for a whole week until my friend gave me the referral that kept me in business. So when I say lucky, I do genuinely mean lucky because I had no hand in it. And it could have been easier if I'd worked harder. I never ended up cold calling or door knocking like many advisors. I never stooped to, bullshitting people or begging people for business, even though I probably should have swallowed my pride at some point and just been more forthright and asked more people if they wanted to work with me. Having somebody string me along for over a year when I first got started, just so they could then say, hey, meet me at the Sonic across the street from their house. So I drove 45 minutes one way, just so they could be like, yeah, we decided no, but good to see you. When no wasn't something I could afford to hear, literally, was a pretty crushing day in my life. And there have been upsets and there have been heartbreaks along the road. And yet today I am grateful. Because despite how hard it was and how hard it has been, despite how scary it was, and it still has been and still can be, this has been the greatest challenge of my life. To build a practice, to be a financial planner, to forego the temptations of easy rewards or high commissions, flashy cars, vacation and luxury trips, and a fancy lifestyle. It's shockingly easy to have BMWs in a garage in this business if you're willing to just sell people the right thing for you and the wrong thing for them. It's hard to do the right thing every day because it's so easy to be a bad person. It's hard to be a good person in this field.
It's hard to be lumped in with a larger crowd of salespeople who enjoy a reputation akin to used car salesmen, even as, at least financially, the world seems perfectly happy to reward them for poor behavior. And yet, financial planning is the most important thing I've done in my career. The people it's helped, the lives it's impacted, the difference it's made in the lives of hundreds of families, dozens of communities, just from my experience alone. I have been the first person someone has called to let know that they are pregnant and expecting their first child. I've also had some couples decide whether they were going to have kids or have more kids based on the advice that we've given them. I've had to hold someone who lost their spouse unexpectedly and delivered the life insurance check to them personally. I've gotten to help open new businesses. I've had to console someone as they shut their business down. And I've been asked more times than I can count at this point to be somebody's executor or trustee for their estate. It's a level of trust and perspective and privilege that I think is seldom replicated in most other lines of work. I'm now in an interesting phase of the practice where, generally speaking, I don't personally take on new clients. There are a few outstanding folks that are or have been in the process for a while that I'll work with directly, and there's the clients that I have already that I work with directly, and I still take great joy in helping my team work with their new and existing clients. But it's a strange place to be when, years ago you would have taken any opportunity. It's a strange place to look at your clients and say, thank you so much for that referral. It means the world to me. But if you could just say Dan's team is great instead of Dan is great, that would make it so much easier to help folks get settled in with a member of the team instead of expecting it to be me or being upset that it's not me. It's been a wild journey. I have unbelievable gratitude that I have made it this far. It truly wouldn't have been possible without every single client the first year. It wouldn't have been possible without the referral that literally kept me alive the second year, and the support and confidence of every client since, and each community member that we share our time with these days. It wouldn't have been possible without each and every client, advocate, and partner that works with us, that refers us, that helps our clients the way we help our clients. I have a list here on my screen, but I think it would probably take me another half hour to thank everyone by name individually. So just know, if you think I might not remember you, or you think that I might not recall what you did to help me and this firm along our journey, trust me, I do. This coming summer, July 16th, we will be celebrating 1 decade of the practice that became and now is the firm, My Wealth Planners. This firm has grown and supported so much more than I ever could have possibly imagined before my 25th birthday when this all started. And I cannot begin to imagine what it's going to look like in the next decade to come. So thank you for listening, for taking part, for being with me and this team on this journey. It has meant the world to me, and I really hope it's meant the world to you too.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.